My name is Diane Martindale, and I'm the president of the board. And we have Looking into Kabul at the museum until September 12th. And its sponsors are the Honeywell Charitable Fund, Reve Lockhart and Jack Rice, Donald and Kathleen Peak. Are you here? Wonderful. Thank you. The Town of Friday Harbor and KCTS Channel 9. So it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Ray, an SJIMA board member and lead of this exhibition, Paths to Understanding Afghanistan.
Well, thank you, Diane. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to be with us tonight for this third and final session in our series, Ask Us About Afghanistan, a presentation and discussion series in support of James Longley's exhibit, Looking into Kabul. That's at the Art Museum now. It is an exhibit of 42 photographs from Kabul, the likes of which will astound you. You will see some of those magnificent photographs tonight. And if you haven't seen the exhibit yet, I urge you to do so. It will be on display until September 12th. And I'd like to say we are honored to have James Longley's mother, Allison Longley, with us tonight. Allison. Thank you for being with us. And again, welcome and thank you to you all. Tonight's presentation and dialogue is about misunderstanding and the paths our speakers have taken towards understanding. James Longley's path as a documentary filmmaker and photographer has been to show with empathy the realities, the inner worlds, and the lives and struggles of ordinary people. His exhibit, Looking into Kabul, is a grand poetry in images of empathy and understanding for the dignity of ordinary Afghans and Afghan humanity. Reverend Terry Kyllo's path as a Lutheran pastor and executive director of Paths to Understanding has been to build bridges over bias and misunderstanding. Bridges built upon relationships of respect with people that we disagree with, in recognition of our common humanity. So, after we airplane mode our phones, if I may, let me begin with these initial prompts for our speakers. For James, even after 20 years of misadventures in Afghanistan, why are we still so blind to the struggles of ordinary people? Why are we still so misunderstanding of Afghan life and humanity? And for Terry, what are the roots of bias? Where does it come from? Is it a natural human inclination? Or have we been taught to suspect others? Why are our differences emphasized instead of our common humanity? How do we harvest empathy, understanding, and compassion to be our best selves? Our attendees, you will have index cards on your handouts to write down questions you may have for our speakers. We'll gather them and read them to our speakers at the appropriate times. So, gentlemen, the stage is yours now. James Longley and Reverend Terry Kyllo.
Thanks, Rob.
That was a beautiful introduction. And it's a beautiful evening, and we're very honored to be here in conversation with all of you tonight. And I'm so honored to be here with James. So James, thank you for this time tonight.
Likewise. And I just want to thank everyone who has supported the exhibition, which has been up all summer and still has a few days left if you haven't seen it. We have a clip here which I'm debating whether or not I should show, because I think at the museum the quality of the exhibition of the video is really good, and maybe that's the best place to see
Show it.
the film. Yeah, especially Reve Luckard and Jack, who I just spent some time with finally yesterday, some quality time, and the Peaks, who supported the exhibition, and Rob and Diane Martindale. Thank you very much for your support. Do you want to begin? Or?
No, we're going to have you go first, but I'd just like to point out that we're all on the ancestral land of the Samish Indian people. I just want us to remember that right now as we have this conversation tonight. Because in my work of being in so many groups in the communities, being in so many churches, talking to so many people, I've really come to understand that a lot of the bigotries that we have toward each other in the Pacific Northwest, many of them are rooted in anti-Indigenous bigotry. So I just want us to remember that this is their ancestral lands, and that we're here on the lands where their ancestors took care of this territory for thousands and thousands of years. So I just wanted to say that first, but James, I'd really be interested in hearing what you have to share with us first.
Well, according to this prompt, even after 20 years of misadventures in Afghanistan, why are we still so blind to the struggles of ordinary people? Why are we so misunderstanding of Afghan life and humanity? I'm going to blame the media. I know it's the wrong thing to do, and the media. We all work very hard. There are a lot of really talented people who dedicated their life to journalism and print journalism, documentary filmmaking, photography, and we go out and we take a lot of risks to understand the world and bring back material from difficult places and all over. But at some level, I think there's a filtration process that happens, a kind of gatekeeping that happens, where we don't always, as a public, I think we miss out on being really able to understand the complexity of a place, because the journalists, the documentary filmmakers, we don't really decide necessarily what we can film. I mean, the editors are really telling people, and then B, there's, for example, my first foray into documentary filmmaking was this 75-minute short feature film about the Gaza Strip, and I set out a little over 20 years ago. Before 9/11, but it was the beginning of 2001, and I just turned 29, and I set off to make a film in Gaza. And I made what I thought was a very good documentary that really showed the situation and what was happening, and just how devastating it was. I mean, I didn't really know what to think. It was the first time that I was making a feature documentary, and it was also the first time that I was going to the Middle East. And so, for me, it was a personal kind of discovery of something that I hadn't really been fully aware of. And I was really apprehensive to go there. But then, having made the film, I felt like I had this kind of secret knowledge that Americans simply weren't privy to, because you could look anywhere on PBS or media, the New York Times, where have you, and you just wouldn't find this reality represented. And in the end, that film was never broadcast in the United States. HBO was interested, but in the end, they wanted a film which was about, that would be about, where the narrative structure would be, a kid being corrupted by Hamas and turned into a militant. And this is the story that they were very interested in. And so they hired another filmmaker to go and make that film. This nice guy from London. The Israelis shot him in the neck with a sniper shot. He's wearing a press vest and a bulletproof vest and a helmet. And they shot him from a guard tower on the border between Israel and between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And he passed away. And so the HBO didn't really get the film that they were looking for. But they also didn't get my film. And I found this happen quite a lot, that you would make a piece of media, and it would get good reviews even, but it was really hard to get it shown far and wide unless the narrative syncs up with the acceptable narrative, the kind of Overton window of acceptable ideas about the Middle East that exists in this country. And I think we're a little bit unaware. I mean, we look at a country like the Soviet Union in the past, and how they had, Pravda and Izvestia, the two kind of propaganda state newspapers, and all of this state television, and really, the Soviets. I lived in Russia for 4.5 years, and at one point I had a Russian girlfriend for a while, and she was telling me these stories about growing up in the 70s and 80s, and how they would be told, all these stories about how the Americans are starving, and we have to collect food in boxes to send to the poor American children who have it so much worse than us here in the Soviet Union. And there's this, tremendous naivete in a situation like that, where the media is really limited and controlled. And I think in the United States we think that our media is so much more free than that, and technically it is. But in reality, we also have a narrow kind of viewpoint that we're all subjected to. And there are certain truths, political truths and sort of realities happening in the world that are beyond the Overton window of the United States, the Overton window being the acceptable discourse of what we're allowed to talk about and know about. And I think that exists here in the United States almost as much as it did in the Soviet Union. Even though we have a free media, and even though we have freedom of speech, there are certain ideas which are simply unacceptable, and we have a kind of national narrative when it comes to things like the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. When these things begin, there are very few people who can speak out against them. Who was the one congresswoman who voted against the Afghanistan war? Barbara Lee, in California. She was the only one. And she was castigated for that. Before the Iraq War, I remember being in Baghdad with Jim McDermott, the congressman from Seattle. And he went there, and he got in front of the cameras from Reuters and AP and all the different news organizations, and he told everyone the truth. He said, look, in Vietnam we invaded, and it turned out to be a terrible war that killed 1 million Vietnamese and 50,000 American soldiers, and it were better not to have done it. In the end, it was a bad idea, and kind of for nothing, and it only did terrible things to Vietnam and to the United States. In the end, there was no benefit to this war. And if we go to war in Iraq, the same thing will happen, essentially. That was his message. And in the media here in the United States, he was called Baghdad Jim for daring to speak the truth and to speak out against an unnecessary, most people would probably say illegal, war. And now I notice that in the United States, the people who spearheaded that misadventure in Iraq are all rehabilitated now. Even the Democrats are in love with George W. Bush because, I don't know, he hugged Michelle Obama or something like this. And we forget about the fact that these people lied us into an illegal war that killed 1 million people, as if it never happened. And I think with Afghanistan similarly, you know, this was a war that everyone was behind in politics and in the media, and it was impossible to speak out against it. And yet, similarly, now, 20 years later, most people would say it was probably a bad idea, we should never have done it. And I think that's true. But because everyone was behind this war, there's almost no discussion, there's almost no reflection, no one talks about it. It just finished a year ago, this war, and there's no real conversation. We talk about now the situation in Afghanistan, how much worse it is under the Taliban since we left. But I got back from Afghanistan a week ago, and the situation there is a lot better than it was when we were there in the country. Except now the economy is destroyed. Yes, and there's slightly less rights for women, especially in the cities. A lot of people have been kicked out of their jobs and left the country. But there's no war in Afghanistan. And this war was claiming tens of thousands of lives a year. And that's all gone now. And now you can drive around Afghanistan. And when you drive around Afghanistan, what you see is all of these HESCO sandbag barriers, these compounds that the United States built all around the ring road, all in these different towns and cities and in the wilderness of Afghanistan. And that's mainly our legacy in the country, is that we left behind a lot of sandbag barrier compounds with machine gun nests. And we ran Afghanistan from behind these kind of garrison walls, and it was never going to have a happy ending. I think if you're in a country and you have to be constantly behind walls in order to protect yourself, and the local population is continuously blowing up your vehicles, I mean, maybe, you know, we should take a lesson from history and know where it's going to lead. But I don't think we see it like that. We see ourselves as, I don't know, when I listen to the Biden administration talking about Afghanistan, he's mostly saying things like, well, you know, it's too bad what's happening in Afghanistan now with the economy and so on, but this is just another problem that the United States can't solve, you know, which makes it sound like we don't have anything to do with the fact that the economy right now is frozen in Afghanistan, even though the United States has openly stolen the entire foreign currency reserve of the country of Afghanistan. And we've said that we were going to give this money to the victims of 9/11. And I guess it would mostly go into the pockets of the trial lawyers for the 9/11 victims. But this money doesn't belong to us. This money belongs to Afghan depositors. It works in the same way that the American Reserve works, where a certain amount of deposits are held in reserve in order to stabilize the currency, be a hedge against inflation, etc., allow people to borrow money against this as collateral. And now Afghanistan doesn't have that, and their economy is frozen, and all of the hundreds of millions of dollars from the IMF and World Bank that were funding their clinics and their hospitals was also cut off. And the government, of course, is not recognized, which means, by the United States, which means that all the other countries that follow in the wake of the United States politically also don't recognize the government, and it's very difficult now for anyone really to do business in Afghanistan. And it's difficult for NGOs to pay their employees, and it's difficult for UNICEF to pay their employees, which should tell you something about the effect that, you know, our sanctions and our policies are having on the economy of Afghanistan, where millions of Afghans are now food insecure. Our sanctions policy will never hurt the Taliban leadership. It will only make them more powerful. in the same way that our sanctions regime against Iraq from 1991 until 2003, when we invaded, we held the most draconian sanctions ever levied against a country against Iraq, and we didn't allow them to sell their oil, or we controlled the sale of their oil and controlled what happened to the money afterwards. But this only kept the Saddam regime in power and made sure that there would never be a powerful populace that would be financially independent, that would have some say in the political future of Iraq. And similarly in Afghanistan, where you have a population that is almost universally poor and impoverished and dependent on the WFP and UNICEF for survival, in that kind of situation, they're never going to rise up and demand things of the Taliban government. It's just not going to happen. We've weakened the population in every respect, politically and physically, through our sanctions policy. So, given that the United States has such an outsized impact on the people of Afghanistan, I think it's really important that we should know about the people of Afghanistan. And somehow, during the course of this 20-year war, we managed not to know very much about them. And I think for different reasons. As I said at the top, I kind of blame the media. We live in a capitalist society where things need to generate a profit. And, counter-narratives, which may be the correct narrative, but things that run counter to what Americans want to believe about Afghanistan are simply not as sellable as narratives which are in line with our belief system about that country. And so in a way, I think in America, we're missing out on the truth a bit because the truth isn't that profitable. It just doesn't, it's not going to make as much money as something which would be either more entertaining or more make us feel better. And so, in a way, I think we're becoming blinded by our own desire to self-soothe as a country and not really take a hard look at ourselves and our policies and what we're doing and what effect that has on other people. And I think in this situation, it tends to be much more easy to, instead of looking at ourselves, to point the finger at others and say, well, it's okay if we have this negative policy in Afghanistan because after all, their society, their culture is so backward that they probably deserve this terrible life that they have. But the truth is that Afghanistan in the 1970s was a country that was a net exporter of food, was a country that was similar to Italy in terms of its development, its phase of development in the late 60s and early 70s. And it could have gone in a very different direction than what it did. And really what we think of in Afghanistan, which is always war, where our picture of Afghanistan is a country at war, this is really the last 40 years. And Afghanistan is in effect a casualty of the Cold War, because of the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 to 89, and our proxy war against the Soviets during that period. That destabilized Afghanistan. Had we not done that, Afghanistan now might be quite likely like other post-Soviet states like Kyrgyzstan, for example, which is not a terribly rich country, but is also not a country that has gone through 40 years of war. And they're much more stable and much more, they've suffered a lot less because we didn't fight a proxy war in Kyrgyzstan. And now I think we had the tables reversed during the last 20 years of war, where we were trying to impose a puppet government that reflected our ideals in the same way that the Soviet Union had their puppet government that reflected their kind of politics. And at the same time, we were fighting an insurgency which was also backed by foreign powers in Afghanistan for their own purposes. Pakistan, for example, wants a hardline Islamic government in Afghanistan for strategic reasons, because they're worried about an invasion by India from the south, and they don't want to have a government in Afghanistan that would support India. And the only way they can guarantee that is by having an Islamist government in Kabul. And so Pakistan is partly responsible for putting the Taliban in power, but so is the United States. After all, I mean, we made a deal with the Taliban that they would come back into power after we left. The government that we supported, the Republic, the NATO-backed government, was never invited to the talks in Doha, where these things were decided about how the United States was going to leave and how the Taliban shouldn't attack the United States while we're leaving. We were in a state of cooperation with the Taliban. But now that the Taliban is in power, we're saying, no, we can't cooperate with you and can't recognize you because, well, I think honestly it's because we have the midterms coming up. And it's kind of, it's political kryptonite to get into bed with the Taliban regime. But the truth is that sooner or later, unless we want to be in a situation like we are with Iran or with Cuba, where we don't have full diplomatic relations and full recognition, and that just goes on for decades and decades, unless we want to have that situation also with Afghanistan, at some point, we will have to recognize the government in Afghanistan. And they, for their part, the Taliban really want to be recognized, and they really want to have good relations with the United States. They recognize how important it is for them, and they're inviting the United States to come back and reopen our embassy in Kabul. But I think for now, it's really the United States which is the intransigent partner in this situation, and we're not ready, having been defeated soundly by the Taliban, we're not ready to go back and be friends with them. We want to pretend that we won the war, just as, I don't know, with the Vietnamese, we somehow managed to have a normal kind of relationship with Vietnam now decades later. And I suppose the same thing could happen in Afghanistan. But what I see more likely happening is a repeat of the same pattern where Afghanistan is used as the field of a proxy conflict. In this case, maybe it will be a proxy conflict with China. As is likely, if the United States and Europe fails to engage economically with Afghanistan, Afghanistan and the Taliban government will have no choice but to engage with China in the way that China prefers. And then I think probably our CIA will be supporting insurgent groups who are fighting the Taliban government, which is in league with China. I think that's a quite likely, probable future for Afghanistan. But it doesn't need to be that way. We could have a different kind of relationship with Afghanistan if we chose to, which would be good for the people. I don't care so much about the Taliban government because, I'm not an Islamist. And I think their rights record is not great, and I disagree with them on a lot of things. And I think their general level of competence is not high. I've met a few of the ministers. Some of them are clever, and a lot of them are not really, they don't have the background necessary to run, a ministry and run a government. But at the same time, there's 38 million Afghans who aren't in the government and don't have really anything to do with this armed insurgency which is now in power. And I think our policy toward Afghanistan, it would be healthier for us to consider those 38 million rather than the 100,000 or so Taliban who are now sitting in the ministries in Kabul and running the checkpoints around the roads of Afghanistan. They're in power now, but they're a vanishingly small group of people compared to the overall population. And I think we need to behave toward Afghanistan in a way almost as if we hadn't just been at war with the Taliban for 20 years. In a way, I think it's the job of the United States now to kind of let bygones be bygones and to renormalize our relationship with Afghanistan for the benefit of the overall population. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Taliban is never going to suffer because of these sanctions. They're only being more politically powerful, just like the government in Iran can always blame the United States for any economic problems that they're having, and with some legitimacy, because we have these sanctions levied against their country. Similarly, with Afghanistan, the Taliban can always say it's not our incompetence that's making us poor. It's the non-recognition of our government and the sanctions against our country, and so it's not really our fault. And the enemy is not us. The enemy is the foreigners who are making our country suffer economically, even after we won and defeated them. So that's it. Hard as it is for us, I think, politically, to accept a defeat and say, you know, we lost the war and now we are not in a position to make demands of the government, really. Because that's the way they feel. And internally, politically, it's not really viable for them inside the Taliban, which is also, you know, it's not a completely homogenous organization. The hardliners, you know, the people who are more open-minded, the people who are more pro-West, you can say, or less extreme, and more practical, will always get shouted down by the hardliners as long as we have this position toward Afghanistan of punitive economic sanctions. So it's always going to be an internal battle inside the Taliban as well that we have to be aware of. It's normal for us in the United States to say, you know, we're so progressive, look, we've allowed women to vote for the past 100 years, and you know, so we're so much more advanced than Afghanistan. And in half the states of the country, women can even control their own reproductive, you know, they can have control of their own bodies in half of the country. So we're so much more advanced than the Taliban, and we're going to tell them what to do and what policies they should have. But the truth is that the more pressure and the more loud the calls are for women's rights and girls' education and so on, the more it seems like a foreign demand. Whereas in fact, it's a domestic demand of Afghan people. This policy of not allowing Afghan girls to go to high school in much of the country is extremely unpopular in Afghanistan. Even people who are very religious and conservative and you know, from provinces that have long been under Taliban control, nobody really likes this policy. The only reason the Taliban have this policy, they came up with it this spring while I was there, is as a negotiating tactic. In the same way that Iran keeps on building centrifuges that they don't really need, and has all of these hundreds and thousands of centrifuges spinning, because then, when they're negotiating with the United States, they have more to put on the table. And similarly, the Taliban, they know that the United States has this one issue that they care about, which is, you know, girls' education, and so they've taken away girls' education so that they have this as a bargaining chip and they can give it back. And the more pressure we put on them from outside, the more untenable it is for them internally to make these concessions, because they feel then they're making a concession to the foreign powers which they have just defeated. So that's what it looks like politically. But the reality is also that girls are going to high school in almost all of northern Afghanistan, and all the private high schools, they are going to high school. It's just, it's a political tactic. In Kabul, and like I was talking to a guy in the Ministry of Education in Kabul, and he owns a number of private girls' high schools, and he said, we never stopped, we never shut our doors, we just continued. And he said, you know, if the schools in the north or whatever, wherever they are, if they call us on the phone and ask us, should we allow girls to go to high school, we say no. But if they don't call us, we don't tell them anything, and they can do whatever they want. So they don't really have a firm policy about this. And it's mainly just something that they're doing for the benefit of the Western media and the Western politicians. And I think that the more we interfere and try to put our hands into it and try to tell everyone there what to do, the worse off it becomes. Because those people, women's rights activists in Afghanistan, were pushing for more women's rights, were pushing for girls' education. They become like agents of a foreign power because that's what the West is demanding. And then it just sounds like they're repeating a foreign demand rather than making their own legitimate domestic demand. So I think it's difficult, but the main thing is now any Afghan will tell you the more important thing than girls going to high school or women having government jobs or anything like this. The most important thing that everyone is thinking about is the economy, because people are living on the edge of starvation, and some people are actually starving. All the time you hear these stories about some parents who passed away from starvation, and their kids were just left in the house until they starved to death, because no one knew what was going on. People selling their children for food, people selling their organs for food. It's a dire situation, and in the United States, in our policy, in our kind of self-righteous inability to admit that we've just lost a war in this country and that we're in no position to make demands, we are responsible in large part for this economic suffering. At least if we were to remove these sanctions and remove the impediments that we've put in front of the economy of Afghanistan, we then would be able to say, look, we're the largest donor to Afghanistan, which we are, we continue to be, and also we're not putting roadblocks in front of the Afghan economy. So then, in that case, I think Biden would be much more legitimate when he says, this is just not a problem that we can solve, if we are in fact not standing in the way of the Afghan economy. So I I wanted to say this as someone who just came back from Afghanistan, and I think, because when I listen to national public radio and I listen to the media in the United States, mainly what I hear is, it's very important for us to keep the pressure on the Afghan government, on the Taliban, because this is very important for the Afghan people. And I think that's wrong. I think that only the Afghan people are really capable of making the internal changes that they want in their politics. And the more this is pushed on Afghanistan from outside onto the government, the more it will be resisted. And yeah, that's mainly what I have to say about that. And I guess instead of rambling along, I would love to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the things that you've been doing here closer to home to counter anti-Muslim rhetoric in our own communities.
So thank you so much for that. So on September 11th, I woke up 2001. My wife came upstairs to wake me up. I was young enough at that time to still love to sleep in, and she said, "Terry, you got to come downstairs." And so before it had gotten to noon, I'd gotten on the phone to other leaders in Anacortes, faith leaders, saying that we have to start, some kind of gathering for the people in our little small town there in Anacortes to be able to grieve what's happened and process what took place that day. And we were able to put together really quite a diverse group of folk. We had evangelicals, even a couple of almost fundamentalists. We had some progressives and congregations as well. And we ended up putting together really two events. The first one was like for all the churches, and then some of the atheists and agnostics and sort of secular humanists in town reached out to me. Sort of an atheist Jewish man reached out to me named Ed. And he said, Terry, we need your help to put together a kind of more of a less religious one of these things, And so I helped put on 2 of these that weekend. In the weeks following, some of the pastors that I'd met with said, hey, let's get together and pray, for the country and sort of thing. And so one day we got together and pray, and it was never perfectly comfortable for me because I'm not of that sort of evangelical persuasion, so it was kind of that culture. But I was okay with that culture of prayer because I could feel like their hearts were in the right place. And but all of a sudden, as I'm heading to this prayer session with this pretty diverse group of pastors, Christian pastors, I heard about the invasion of Afghanistan. And so what I heard around that prayer circle really scared me, because it was praying for George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld and all of these folk, these characters that had been proposing all this stuff. And so when it came time for me to pray, I said, well, Creator, I pray for every single human being and every animal and plant in Afghanistan. And I prayed that they would be safe today. And I felt the room grow cold. I mean, it was like a deep freeze in there. And there wasn't any, when they were praying for George W. Bush, it was amen and thank you, Jesus. When I prayed for everybody in Afghanistan, it was like, it was bad. So afterward, one of the pastors walked up to me, and he said to me, how could you pray for our enemies? Right, so there's this little thing called the Christian Scriptures that Christians pay some attention to. And I said, well, because Jesus told me to. And then he said, well, not those enemies. As if Jesus put a parenthetical statement in. Well, we're only talking about the enemies on the playground, or, when you're playing cribbage against somebody, you got to pray for that enemy, But I couldn't believe it that he came out with that. And then he said, well, we're supposed to obey the governing authorities. Right? And of course, this is from a tradition whose founder did not obey the governing authorities and was in fact murdered on trumped-up charges by the governing authorities. Now, there are scriptures that say, look, you got to pick your battles. And a lot of the laws in a community, even in the Roman Empire, were okay. Don't steal and that kind of stuff. So we're not against order, but we're also for a transformation of that order. And so what I said to him was, well, we the people in the United States of America are the governing authorities, and we have the right and in fact the responsibility to question policies that our government puts forward, because that's who we are as a people. And I thought that would be okay, because there was an American flag in the room where we were praying. Turns out that he said, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. And he shook his head. And that was the last time I went to that prayer group, which maybe was a mistake on my part. So the questions I got to talk about tonight, which I'll be able to easily answer in 10 minutes, are what are the roots of bias? Where does it come from? Is it a natural inclination, or have we been taught to suspect others? Why are our differences emphasized instead of our common humanity? How do we harvest empathy, understanding, and compassion, and to be our best selves? So it was very difficult in those days for anyone to question the U.S. policy toward Afghanistan and later on toward Iraq. My congregation in Anacortes Celebration Lutheran Church, we began to hold some conversations about the Iraq War before it started. And one day, as we were preparing for some of these conversations, these were gentle conversations, I got a call from a man who said, Pastor Terry, I like to have the pastor's ear. That's what he sounded like. And I said, well, I'm happy to listen to what you have to say, like I am with everyone. And basically the message was, if you don't stop having these conversations, I'm going to take my money and go. And I said, well, we're going to miss you. Okay, what's going on there? So James just talked about the media, that is we're talking about journalism and other forms of media that help convey like what the rest of the world is like to us. And there is a media that like is trying to like propose different messages within a pretty narrow range, and I do agree with you. But we also have eyeballs and ears and hearts that are consuming that media. And human beings, we just don't like hearing things that don't fit with our predetermined, worldview. That's called confirmation bias. And then because we have the media system that we have, which is run by advertising, well, the advertising agencies and the companies that pay them money to get their name out there don't want messages that are too disturbing. And so we have a deadly cycle that creates a national narrative that is quite difficult for people to break out of. And my little congregation in Little Anacortes, worshiping in an elementary school gym, we're trying to break out of some of that narrative. And what happened was that 10 families in my congregation left. Because we dared to question. And primarily what we questioned wasn't necessarily all the foreign policy, although we did talk about that. It was the use of God language to say that those policies were right. The use of God language by members of the Bush administration to say, well, George W. Bush prays. And so therefore his policy has to be okay. Because he's a Christian. And so we dared to do that, and we lost 40% of our income. Now, we were fine. We merged into a conversation with the Episcopalians, right? And we became partners with the Episcopal churches. It wasn't like, life ended. But that's part of the economic pressure. So I was a Lutheran pastor working, I've been ordained for 31 years, and about 6 years ago, serving in a different town in Marysville, I began to do some multi-faith dialogue with a Buddhist and a Muslim. And it was beautiful. We talked about all kinds of issues. It wasn't show and tell. We're talking about real stuff, And we were invited to go to Oak Harbor, me and my Muslim friend, to engage with people around like, anti-Muslim bigotry in Oak Harbor, because it was pretty thick there. And I got up there on the stage with my Muslim friend. I didn't know what I was doing. I was terrible. I had a good heart, but that was about it. And what I saw from that stage scared me. Because what I saw on that stage were people hating him without knowing him. Making all kinds of assumptions about Islam and 1.7 billion Muslims, bringing up Afghanistan and Iraq and all kinds of issues with Saudi Arabia and Iran, and funneling all of that, focusing all of that hatred and rage and misinformation on him. And what I learned was that misinformation didn't just happen. So we went on and did a couple other towns, and in every town we heard the same questions in the same order, framed in the same way. Like, what is going on here? Are the same people following us around? I swear they're not like wearing makeup and stuff. And then I began to realize, through the work of some other scholars, that there were anti-Muslim hate groups spending 30 to 40 or plus millions of dollars a year to spread disinformation and dehumanization of American Muslim neighbors. That politicians, every May, start anti-Muslim bigotry language going on. A lot of us versus them conversations. And a lot of times what they would do is they would reference 9/11. The 9/11 was this incredible marker that changed all of human history, and that 10 billion years from now we'd still be referencing it. Well, what was it about that what was the power in that they were activating? And to that I want to get to the question that was placed before us here. So just think about yourself for a minute. Just sink down into your stomach as a person. We can kind of do that. Be aware of your body. And, we're powerful. We got brains, we got good hearts, but we're also vulnerable, aren't we? Is there a person in this room that's like Superman or something? Are all of you vulnerable? You bet, I am too. And then, so that vulnerability for us is, that's scary to think about. It's scary to feel about that, right? But we have to learn as human beings to integrate some of that vulnerability into us, except that Americans aren't really great at that. We tend to push that away. I mean, most people, when they come to a funeral, and I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of funerals, like they want their grief to go away in 3 weeks. Because we don't grapple well with our vulnerability. But as human beings, we use our in-group, the group that we're with, we use our culture to help us sort of process that vulnerability. And what happens, according to terror management theory, which you can look up, people have actually tested this, that when those planes flew into the buildings and the buildings came down, what happened is that most Americans felt like it was a personal attack, and we became unavoidably aware of our own mortality and vulnerability. And in those circumstances, most everyone will stand up and say, I'm going to stand up for my team. And a lot of times what we do is we say, I'm going to stand up for my team against someone else. So as long as human beings have been around, we've survived in part because we've had in-groups. We've had a clan. We've had a family. And we know that we can't do all the things necessary for survival, but together we can. And there is a natural tendency called in-group bias to think that our group is pretty awesome and other groups are not so great. But it's important to remember that for a large part of human history, human groups with differences culturally, religiously, have gotten along pretty well. It really wasn't until human beings started to really get power over each other and to deny death, really even affects us much, that we began to try to get power over each other. And so one of the challenges here in the conversation is this sort of in-grouping and out-grouping a natural thing? Or is it something that is imposed on us? And the reality is it's both. So from the Christian tradition point of view, we're all vulnerable. We have certain vulnerabilities as human beings. One of them is to confirmation bias, not accepting information that disturbs us. We have in-group, out-group bias, thinking that other people are less than human and we're the only really human ones. All those are potential negatives or vulnerabilities for human beings. But we have a lot of positive potentials too. And so what I think is happening for us, we need to have a more complex conversation about this, because when I was a young pastor, I would hear all the baby boomers. Are there any baby boomers here that I'm going to offend? I am so sorry if I'm going to offend you, but baby boomers were like, dude, in the 60s we started wearing jeans and everything's going to get better from here. I heard that over and over again. That we're just on a never-ending scale. But we need a more nuanced and thoughtful conversation about human vulnerabilities and human potentials. Because both are true and both are there. And so the fact of the matter is we are a bit vulnerable to dehumanize people who are on the outside, and we are also capable of recognizing people and other in-groups as human. So what these hate groups are doing to us, what our politicians are doing to us, and what our national narrative does, is it's actually creating not only an us versus them, but leading us into a different kind of conversation and thought process, emotional process about people of difference, across differences. And so the dehumanization process, says a guy named Jonathan Leader Maynard, often works like this. Someone proposes an us and a them. They say that the people who are part of that out-group, that other in-group, are a threat to us. If one person in that group does something wrong, we apply collective blame to the whole group. We assume that if Taliban leaders believe something or do something, that must be true of all Muslims. Or of all Taliban leaders, right? And we begin to construct this idea that they are such a threat to us, that it is morally right, it is necessary, it's even laudable to do violence against them. And that a beautiful future awaits if we act now, but only if we act in violence toward that group. And we need to do it often proactively. That process of dehumanization, we are very vulnerable to for one very powerful reason. And you're going to think I'm crazy. But it's because we love. It's because someone leverages what we love to turn people of one in-group against another. And here's one example. I've got lots. A guy named Charles, who I love. He cared for his wife while she had Alzheimer's. He was so gentle and so patient with her. He raised 3 daughters, and he walked up to me after I had begun to leave parish ministry to try to counter anti-Muslim bigotry in Washington State. I went and did a presentation in one of the churches I used to serve, and his face was beet red. He was so angry with me, he could not speak until the whole thing was done. And he walked up to me and he stuck his finger in my face and he said, "How can you stand with those people who treat women that way?" It was what he loved. It's what he valued that was being leveraged by misinformation and by a process of dehumanization of American Muslims and Muslims around the world. And so this is what I said. I said, "Charles, you know I value and honor and respect the role of women. My wife is powerful and strong. I raised 2 strong, competent, independent daughters. You've heard me preach before about Jesus having Mary sit at his feet, and Mary all of a sudden being accepted into rabbinical school, right? You know where I'm at." He says, "Yes, and that's what I can't understand." And I said to him, "Did you know that in Islam there were a package of rights given to people in the 7th century that in a lot of places in the world we're still catching up to?" And he said, "I didn't know that." And I said, "I'm not saying that there aren't Muslims around the world that don't mistreat women, or don't mistreat kids. I'm not saying that. But I said, doesn't that happen in supposedly good Christian households? Doesn't that happen here in America?" And to his credit, he was able to take that love that was leveraged in him to start hating on other people and let it go a little bit. And he said, "You know, maybe I need to broaden out my news sources." I mean, that's rare. So a lot of the work I've done in the last 6 or 7 years has been to go into smaller towns and communities and create partnerships amongst churches and mosques and synagogues or temples or whatever, whoever's there, and create space using my privilege, because most pastors will return my call. And I've got a big Rolodex. I don't have a Rolodex. I have a big database of pastors all over the state. And I would call them up and say, "Hey, my name's Terry. I've been authorized by the Episcopal Lutheran Churches in Western Washington, and I would love to come and create a conversation with you about how your community can stand against the dehumanization of American Muslims. Would you be willing to talk to me?" And most of the time they would. And so we did public events all across the state where I used my white male cisgender, heterosexual privilege with a pastor collar and black shoes and stuff to create space for Muslim voices. Because here's the positive potential of human beings. Yes, we can get into in-grouping and out-grouping. We can think those other people aren't human. We can resist new information because we have confirmation bias, all that kind of stuff. But if I have to bet between all of that and the hate groups with all their billions of dollars and all the politicians with their us versus them rhetoric that gets them more votes, because we're all afraid, and because we're all afraid we're going to die, and if we just get rid of those people, everything will be fine. If I have to bet against the entire mass of all of that, versus the potential that happens when human beings get together, sit across the table, and eat with each other, when we actually hear each other speak for the first time out of our common human vulnerability and potentiality and all of our loves, when we begin to work together to make the world a better place in some way and do good to and with each other, when we can show up and stand up with each other in public, that is so powerful it can overwhelm all of that negatively. And so despite the fact that all that like sort of dehumanization infrastructure is so much present in the world, and I need to be very clear, it's present in all of you, except for me because I'm a pastor and I'm kidding. No, in fact, what I say to people all the time, once they begin to realize, oh, I have some anti-Muslim bigotry, what I say to them is, I am still working on mine. We're walking the same path. And after every public event that I do with American Muslims, I always ask them a question. And it's not a neutral one. I ask, how did I disadvantage you? Because I know that growing up in this society, growing up in a small town in eastern Washington state, absorbing the media that I absorb, listening to the politicians I listen to, that I have tons of anti-Muslim bigotry in me, that I have more work to do. And so I believe that we can begin to harvest empathy and understanding and compassion, but we've got to make sure we do it in person and with each other and do it in public. So my last story. So I was in a really nice church. It was a really beautiful, nice, progressive church. They had beautiful, progressive, inclusive songs. I mean, it was a beautiful, inclusive, wonderful building. And, they had all kinds of purity statements like, I just want to make sure that I, come forward and I acknowledge my privilege in these conversations, like all that kind of stuff, right? And that's okay. But as I was talking about this, a woman put her hand up and she said, I've never thought that any of those things about Muslims. And I actually used the naughty word a little bit, but I won't use it here. I said, your Muslim neighbors don't care if you've never had a negative thought about it. And the whole room went quiet. And I said, what your Muslim neighbor wants to know, what your Jewish neighbor wants to know, what your indigenous neighbor wants to know, what your atheist neighbor wants to know, because there's tons of anti-atheist bigotry, isn't what you think about them. The question is, are you willing to stand up with them in public when they need you to stand up for their civil and human liberties? That's what I want to know. And that's the same question I ask everybody. If I have an atheist come up to me and say, I don't believe all that stuff, I'll say, I don't care. If I see a Christian walk up to me, their chest puffed up about all their bright ideas and all their great theology, I don't care. I mean, that's great. But the question is it going to lead us into courageous risking that begins with us just getting to know each other in the first place? As we begin to eat together, doing good to and with each other in the community, and standing up and associating with each other in public. Because if we don't do that, the forces in this country are going to leverage our hate and fear and our ignorance and drive us as American citizens, as human beings, apart. And the question in front of all of us right now is political violence is on the rise in this country as 4% of Americans say they're ready to do political violence. The question in front of all of us in this room is, are we going to have the courage to know each other, to do good with each other, and to stand up for each other in public? And I hope in this kind of pivotal moment in America that the answer for all of us will be to do our own small part and leverage the beautiful parts of human nature, of empathy and understanding and compassion, but to add to those the courage to be with each other and work together for the common good, because there still is one.
Is it a good time to answer some questions from the audience? I think there are some.
We have some questions that you've written down, if you want to pass them to the center aisles, and we'll gather them up. James, I was wondering, as we do that, if you might show that beautiful clip from your wonderful movie, Angels Are Made of Light, or any of the other images of the magnificent photos you.
Sure. This is me and my sound guy, Jamshid Amiri, in 2012, 10 years ago, when we started making our film. And Jamshid Amiri is now with his family in a hotel in northern Macedonia, where he's been for the last year. I think on the 14th of September, he's going to fly to Toronto, Canada, and they're all going to become Canadian citizens. And really everyone I worked with in Afghanistan on the previous film is not out of the country. They're all in the United States or the United Kingdom or Germany. And so the person I'm working with now in Afghanistan is a guy with a master's degree in international relations, but he's also from a village out in Maidan Wardak, which is a place which is under Taliban control. So for the first time now, after the fall of the previous government and the rise of the Taliban, I'm finally able to see outside of Kabul, Afghanistan, in a way that I wasn't able to before because of the security situation. We made a film in the school, the Daikiki Palki school, which is an old neighborhood of Kabul, more traditional neighborhood of Kabul. And I chose that place because I thought it would be demographically more similar to the way Afghans were living all over the country. It was more like being in a village than in a big city in this particular neighborhood. So it more accurately reflected the kind of socioeconomic level of Afghans all over. I don't know whether this is going to play or... Yes. Our screen is a little bit limiting here, but we should be able to see something, I guess. I'm afraid the subtitles might not be readable. You'll let me know if we need to stop early.
یاد انفجارات زیاد شد و مردم زیاد برآمدن نمیتونن از خانه خود.
نبی لازم دستی؟ چی می‌کنی؟ فوتبال می‌کنی؟ تو نبی برو بازی.
Personas que chantan.
Chantas, resta.
درست؟ چی؟ خلای که روز نچیست ساخته شده؟ آرمان ساخته شده بگوشیم که انها والدین میتونن با
فرشته از نور هستن. ایره خداوند جل جلاله مقرر کرده که ما وارد دیده نمیتونیم که اگر در زمین تاشن مثل مهاجری خود نشان نمیتن. ما مسلمان وارد چیری در یک انسان مدرایه.
Unit 5, Lesson 1. Past tense of be. Past tense of be. بودو چه رقم میگه؟ I was a student in 1393. Bishop, your friend is going to talk about Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan.
In the name of Allah, Sardar Muhammad Dawood Khan, he was as born in 1909.
Born or born?
Born in 1909, and he was president of Afghanistan, and died in 1978.
نصایح بزرگانه که خونده بوده روز بگو
دادگاه تلویزیون با روار در کشور عزیز افغانستان در اواخر سال 1356 هجری شمسی در زمان جمهوریت
سردار محمد داوود خان
به فعالیت آغاز کرد که در آنگاه تنها
در علم کی دور میکرد که در افغانستان داود خان از بین میره، خاندان زایدی سلطنتی از بین میره، در خاک کی میگشت. در علم که از دور نمیکرد.
بخوان بچه
بنیاد ظلم در جهان اول اندکی بوده است. هر که آمد بر او
مزید کرد
تا
بدین باید
رسید.
انسان که سر ظلم از اندک بگیره تا آخر ظلم نمی باشه. مقصد از این پادشاه از این چیز بده.
ترکی ادب میزد میگه ده خلق و خشم ده خدای قهر دی. راست است. اون باز طوفان زد، طوفان انقلاب ترکی اون مردم داخل شدن حکومت و ریاست جمهوری را وقتی اعلام شد دیر کرده بودن که بیا حکومت شاهی خلاص شد، جمهوری خلاص شد، انقلاب شد، در غریب است اگر بیچاره است، کلگی آن به قدرت به کار بار به همه چیز میرسه. دنگ دور دادن شروع شد، باجه برآمد از من رست بده. دختران کالای سبز جانش میکرد، بسیار مردم کالای سبز جانش میکردن، تم میکردن. مردم نان آرام تا فعلا نخوردن دیگه. همین بود که در اسلامی ترکیل خفک از کش خودش شد. اسلامی نفر سیاهی بود. همون گفته بود که 1 میلیون من نگاه میکنم جوان در کلش ختم میکنم دیگه ملت ختم میکرد. همین کشتن و بستن و بردن و زندان مردم فرار شده کوه بلوش. روز داخل خاک افغانستان شدن خاک ازوال کس بعد از که همین از بین دست کارمند شد. من دوری کارمل هم تیز شد، دوری امین هم تیز شد، ترکی هم ششتو. نجیب گرفت. گپ از گپ گذاشته بود. مثل انار را شبلیدن که زدمی غم کسی را نخورد. این تا فعلا به می حالت است.
خلیفه با من گفته میرفت گفتم می پشت انگلیه بگی یا پشت درست بگی. او هم نکده قیاد نداره. در میدان دکان که میشیرم مردم خوب مردم خراب یا بد چرا میبینم یا زن یا مرد چیزا رو میبینم. خداوند رو دیده نمیکنه. دهن با قدرتش جاوید زمین، آسمان، کوها، دریاها، حیوانها، انسانها کل چیز پیدا کرده. ما رو پیدا کرده. اینجا بالاست ما در پایین. دو آسمان هاست. مرگ سر هر کس انسان است. مرگ آمدنی است. روز قیامت آمدنی است. هر چیز آمدنی است.
عید قربان به حقیقت ز خداوند کریم آفتابی به شب ظلمت انسان آمده. امروز میگو که ابراهیم دو نفری در یک قوم خداوند میگه که ابراهیم فرزندت رو بلدانه بسیار دوست داشت. دو نفر در یک فرد جاگزین نمیشه. ابراهیم فرزند را باید بکشی. ابراهیم فرزند نازدانه خود را به دستور پروردگار میگه خدایا تو میگه فرزند ایبون خانواده ما را بودی ببرد تبدیل. پروردگار برش پرچی را و روان کرد که باعث نجات فرزندش هم شد.
برای مقدسم نداره. زیادتر این پایانش برادر خود تره کنه. قرکور دوست دارم میره دوست نداره.
I would encourage those of you who want to see the film properly with good color and good sound and everything. It's still playing at the gallery, San Juan Gallery upstairs, and there the television has really good color and subtitles are easily readable. It's 117 minutes, almost 2 hours long. So this is just a small snippet of it. But I promise in the original video, maybe not with this projector, but it looks much better. Do we have questions that we can answer?
Yes, gentlemen, we have a few questions. Number one, what is the best way for an individual to help Afghan girls get educated?
Well, I guess that's for me. What is the best way to help Afghan girls get educated? Well, I mean, it's a good question because, there are a lot of things preventing girls from getting educated besides, religious authority. Mainly the poverty of families prevents them from sending girls to school. A lot of families, they simply need all the children to work because they're too poor. I visited a lot of orphanages in the last 6 months. In March, I drove all around Afghanistan, thousands of miles, and I visited a lot of orphanages, including girls' orphanages in Herat and Kabul, and some mixed orphanages. And there, the kids were telling me, well, look, this orphanage is actually shut down right now. Like I went to an orphanage in the north of Afghanistan, in Sadaqul, and they said it's shut down right now because we don't have $2,500 a month to pay for the food to feed these 60 kids. And because of that, the orphanage is closed and everyone is back with their extended families, and all the kids are working. They're all selling plastic bags in the marketplace and all of this, and because of that, they can't go to school. So I guess I would suggest that, step one is really alleviating the poverty and the hunger in Afghanistan, and then people worry about their education. But, the people's stomachs come first. You can't study on an empty stomach. So that's kind of like step number one, I think, in Afghanistan, to getting to a place where everyone can be educated. is first to help the overall economic situation of people. As I mentioned, the private schools are all working for girls going to high school. So you could say the wealthier girls mainly are getting an education. It's really the poor who are being affected mostly by these policies. And I think, there's an organization called ASEEL, ASEEL. I think if you go to aseel.com, but it's an Afghan NGO, and there you can support families if you want. You can, if you don't have a family in mind, if you don't know any Afghan families, then you can, I'm sure they can hook you up with one to support. I directed about, I don't know how much, it was like $20,000 worth of aid through this group to support the teachers in the school where I filmed, their teacher collective, 65 different families. And we did that a couple of times right after the fall of Kabul because the economic situation was so dire and people weren't receiving any salaries at that time. And so they're a reliable organization. I guess if I were faced with that question, I would, it really depends on the particular situation of the families, but mostly families need enough economic support so that they are able to send their children to school. And, they need more schools to be built, they need more teachers training programs. I visited schools in Maidan Wardak where the teachers only had third grade education. But they're doing their best. I mean, they're really dedicated and hardworking and they wanted to do better. But they're working sometimes with very little in schools that are literally falling apart and don't have windows. And so the kids are all sitting on the floor with no desks and they don't have enough pens and paper. So, I mean, Afghanistan is going through a period of intense poverty, and that, more than anything else, is limiting the education potential for kids.
Another for you, James. How safe do you feel in Afghanistan?
Well, in the past, so how safe did I feel in Afghanistan? Under the previous government, there was a war going on, as you know, and because of that, I could almost not get out of the capital. Even in Kabul, journalists, I remember there was a journalist from, I think it was Finland or Sweden or something, Sweden, he was Swedish, radio journalist, and someone came up behind him and shot him in the back of the head on the sidewalk as he was walking on the street in Kabul with a small caliber weapon. And and Afghan journalists were getting killed all the time, and people would break into the Serena Hotel in some social event and kill everyone, including all these, journalists. And so I felt like I was under threat kind of all the time because the war was going on, and no Westerner was safe. So I could really only travel a small amount. I would travel up to the Panjshir Valley from Kabul sometimes and go swimming in the river, which was magnificent. But I didn't really feel, I felt safe enough to make my film, and Afghan people are very nice and they want to be very hospitable. But at that time, because of the war, it was dangerous for them to show their true hospitality, because then that would put a target on their back if they were being too nice in public to foreigners. There's always some risk that someone would take revenge on them. Because you have to remember, during the war, in Kabul, everyone supported the government and no one liked the Taliban because the Taliban was, blowing up buses of police cadets or what have you. But you have to remember that out in the villages, there was a war going on. And in this war, thousands of civilians were killed with CIA drone strikes just by accident because they're just, there's some Taliban guy and he has his phone in his pocket and, he's just a guy from the village and they'll get together with 8 other guys and they'll go hunting in the mountains for rabbits. And a drone will come and because he has his phone in his pocket, it knows that this guy is on the list of Taliban characters. And so they kill all 8 of the people, including this Taliban guy. And in the village, it's just, the CIA, the Americans, they've killed all of our boys. And that's how it goes down. And so there's a lot of, and there are all these night raids going on all the time. And now I go out to these villages and I talk to the people. It was impossible to go there before. You couldn't go, you would have been kidnapped or something, or killed. Because they were flying C-130 attack planes around in a circle above these villages and firing machine guns down into the town. They were strafing buildings with Apache helicopters, and it was war, and it was unseen by the United States, but not unseen by the Afghan people. Just like we had atrocities in Vietnam, where you had the My Lai massacre, things like that. Things like that were happening in Afghanistan as well, that we just never heard about. But the Afghans were well aware of what was going on, if they were living outside of the cities, or if they had relatives living in these towns. And so the perception of the Americans and of NATO was very different than, I think, how we perceive ourselves. But now, under the current situation, I feel pretty safe, I have to say. A couple of weeks ago, like a month ago, there was that drone strike that supposedly killed al-Zawahiri in Kabul, and a piece of shrapnel from that drone strike hit my house. It actually went through my window and went through the screen and knocked a big chunk of the plaster out of the wall and almost hit my housemate. It was my housemate's room. And we were living like a kilometer away from the drone strike. So that was kind of the most dangerous thing that happened, was almost getting hit by Americans in shrapnel, really, in the last 6 months. And driving can be a little sketchy. You're on these 2-lane highways where it's all these coal trucks, and everyone's trying to pass these coal trucks and swerving into oncoming traffic. That's dangerous, I think. But other than that, if I were an Afghan journalist, I would feel a lot more under threat going out and covering stories. But as a Western journalist, the Taliban actually has kind of a kid's glove type of treatment, and they're trying to be very nice to all the foreigners. They say that they've registered 600 journalists so far, the Taliban government. So I don't know if that's a little or a lot, but it's more than one a day. And I've seen a lot of journalists there, and I'm on the WhatsApp chat of all the Western journalists in Afghanistan, and plus a lot of Afghan journalists. So I know anytime someone gets arrested, anytime someone gets beaten, I hear about it. And there are problems for sure in Afghanistan with safety, but maybe I just don't have the right mentality to, I guess I'm not really the right person to ask, because, I'm the person who doesn't feel strange going to Iraq in the middle of the war and making a film, or going to Afghanistan in the middle of the war and making a film. But now, there's really no war in Afghanistan, except in a very limited area of the Panjshir province and maybe a couple other places, but there's almost no fighting in the country. And so, and I have all of my paperwork. I have my visas and all of these letters from different ministries. I've gone through the process. I spent a month just getting all these stamped letters from different ministries. And so when I go through Taliban checkpoints, most of the time, because I look like this and I'm wearing Afghan clothes, and they don't even recognize me as a foreigner, and I'm just waved through. And sometimes when they stop us, and they're looking, because we have the cameras and recorders and things in the back of the car, they'll look at these papers. But I've never really been detained in any serious way. Sometimes they ask me to, we have to inform them when we're in the province. We call up the security office or whatever, and we just say, we're here filming. They ask us to do this. And sometimes they'll say, oh, the chief of police of this province wants to see you. But it's just because they want to see the American, because there's so few Americans there. And they want to see this American up close. They want to have a conversation with me and ask me what I think about things. So, but it's not really, there's no particular danger for someone like me. I feel pretty safe there. But don't tell anyone, because I'm interested in getting hazard pay and everything. But it's much safer now than it was, because the war was over. So,
This one for you, Terry. How is Pathways to Understanding working to bridge the enormous chasm in the politics of our country?
So my organization's name is Paths to Understanding, and we sort of see two huge problems. One of them is that we're dangerously unequal in the country, with people of many different cultural groups, racial groups, unable to realize that all the stated promises of our country have equal opportunity. And we work on that by helping to teach white Christian congregations how to be effective allies with people in groups who are experiencing some kind of marginalization. But we're also really concerned about this division issue. And so we're right now working, we're working really hard on it right now, a new project called Let's Go Together. Let's Go Together we worked really hard on that branding, because we wanted to find something that was simple and that like a 4-year-old could say, like, hey, let's go together, And so we got our logo stuff, and we're going to be starting in Burlington, Mount Vernon, in Skagit County, coming up this fall. And it does exactly what I talked about during my little talk, which was we want to get people from across different divides, conservative, liberal, different economic situations, people of different religious traditions, service clubs together, to just get together and eat and share stories. No politics, no ideology. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. Number 2, to do a service project together. Because like a lot of men especially, like we don't just sit and bond over coffee. We like want to get a shovel out and like start fixing something. That's where a lot of us, find that camaraderie. And then lastly, to march in the parade together once a year. And we're going for big grant money right now. We hope that we can really get enough to eventually make this more of a national project. And here's what's just a little bit different about it than some other things you may have heard of. There's a lot of efforts right now to get together and have civil conversation. And I am like totally in favor of all those. But I was talking to a Buddhist friend, and I said, well, hey Genjo, he's a Zen Buddhist. I said, what is the Buddhist wisdom about what to do when we all feel like we're enemies? He says, well, first you got to sit down and you make eye contact and you see each other as people, and then you come to some kind of agreement, and then you do something with each other. And I thought to myself, well, that sounds a bit like someone I know of named Jesus, who said, love your enemies, pray for those that persecute you, do good to those who harm you. Most of us think that that's naive. It's actually an ancient strategy. It's ancient wisdom that gives us a strategy for how to deal in a situation in which we are so divided, in which we have, according to Liliana Mason, and I think she's right in that wonderful book that she did in 2018, 2019, talking about how we've pulled ourselves into the situation where we are like into 2 mega identities in the country, and where people are finding their whole identity wrapped up in their political party. That's exceptionally dangerous. And what's also happened, the pandemic accelerated it, is that we see a lot of people siloed in such a way that they don't know people from other groups. And so we know from research and from the ancient wisdom that when we're in a situation like this, it's time to stop talking about our ideology, all of our differences. I think that's okay to do that, but I think we've got to begin by knowing each other's story a bit, by doing good to and for each other, and then showing up in public so that we the people can remember that we are we the people. And we can have differences about policy, but we don't have to be enemies, and we don't have to walk down the path of a civil war because we are so sure everybody else on some other side is crazy and hates the country. So that's our little effort, and you can go to our website and kind of find out more about it. The first step is to work with Christian congregations in smaller towns and cities and ex-urban areas. We really want to target those areas because we know that as the population increases, so will the cultural and religious diversity in those places. We've got to show in those communities that diverse people can come together and build the community together. Because we know that our good friend Steve Bannon is going to be telling them that we can't live together. And he's full of it. He's full of it. But in order to show people that, we've got to be full of enough love to get out there and be with each other.
I think we have time for one more. There are questions about those beautiful people, James, in your photographs and the film. Do you know what has happened to them in particular? Do you know what has become of those beautiful girls you have in your photographs?
Well, most of the girls in these photographs, like this girl buying balloons or these girls buying bread, I never spoke to them. This is just street photography. And they probably never knew that I was taking their picture. So I don't really know, but I mean, this is 10 years ago. I assume they're who knows. But, you know, this girl, for example, she was a first grader in the school where I was filming. It was really difficult to film women and girls there, although I did it. In my film, there are two women teachers who have speaking parts, who narrate their own sections of the film, and there's one girl there as well. And of them, I really only know what's become of the mother of the main family that I'm filming in the movie. And they're still in Kabul. They tried to get out during the evacuation. I tried to help them get out, along with a lot of the people who worked on my film. But they didn't make it. And they're still in Kabul. The younger kids in that family are trying to finish school, and the older kids are trying to find a job, you know. And the oldest brother is in Iran. He smuggled himself across the border, and he's trying to get into Europe, just like so many of the young guys from Afghanistan. All the families need someone outside of the country who can work and make money and send money back to Afghanistan. That's their kind of lifeline for them now, because the economy isn't good enough to support the population on its own internally. So, you know, I know the fate of a number of people in my film, but because of the kind of gender apartheid and sort of gender divide, especially about filming, filming is such a taboo in Afghanistan. It didn't used to be, I think, back in the 70s and 80s, in the 90s. There wasn't this huge taboo about girls being on camera, but I think the war really changed people's attitudes, the level of danger in the country. People started to feel that it was a risk to be photographed, especially for girls and women, especially after the 1990s civil war between the Mujahideen groups after the expulsion of the Soviets. You saw in this clip some material from the 1977-78 communist revolution in Afghanistan, and you could see there in that clip there are women women wearing full burqa, but there are also women who are totally uncovered. The color, you can't see the color, but it's all, they're all wearing the red of the Communist Party and all of this stuff and making these human pyramids and so on. I went through all this archival material in order to find, in Kabul, in the Afghan National Film Archive, in order to find all of these archival pieces, but there's 3 islands of archival material in the film. And in looking at that, you really see how the culture changed. Looking at the material from the 60s and 70s, there was all this stuff of like women driving cars around and all of this stuff that you just don't see very much now. This woman on the left, though, who I photographed 10 years ago, she was a driving instructor in Kabul. She was maybe one of 2 women driving instructors in Afghanistan. And I don't know what's become of her now, but I imagine she's no longer teaching driving. The country has become more conservative. I was able to photograph girls like this young girl who I photographed on Eid, because it was a religious holiday, and somehow it seemed people felt it was appropriate on this holiday to have their photographs taken. And she's very young, and at this age, no one really cares. She's not wearing any hijab or anything. All of that starts a bit later. The kid on the left is in my film, Nabiullah. They call him the cat. Nabi means the cat. And he's in Turkey now. He's made his way all the way to Istanbul. He's also trying to get into Europe and support his family. And his younger brother as well. His younger brother who is here. Now he's 16, 17 years old, and he's also trying to leave the country. All the young guys in Afghanistan are trying to leave so that they can help their families survive economically. I met a lot of kids that in that same neighborhood where I used to film. I went back and I saw these kids that, they were just little tiny tykes when I was filming, and now they're 14 or something. And all of them said, yeah, we're going to follow our older brothers to Europe. So you can imagine a 14-year-old kid preparing to smuggle himself across an international border into Iran. And in Iran, Afghans are often treated very badly, like second-class citizens. I don't want to make any stereotypes or anything, but they often have problems there. So it's a difficult road for them to pass through on their way to Turkey and then into Europe. But even at that young age, they're 13-year-old kids making this trek over the mountains, being shot by border guards when they come into Turkey. It's a very dangerous trek, but people are making it, even at a young age.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for sharing your respective paths to understanding. Could we show our appreciation, please? Thank you.